I've given a number of presentations about my father, Henry Larsen, who was captain of the St Roch, which went through the Northwest Passage during the wartime years. And so today I'm giving a presentation about the connections between him and Roald Amundsen, who was the first man to conquer the Northwest Passage in 1903 to 1905. I think one of the things that's appropriate to start with is this bit from a poem written by Bjornson, who was a Nobel laureate in literature in around 1903, I believe. And just a couple of little lines. Norwegian seamen are a solid lot, full of strength and cunning more than most. Wherever ship can swim, they lead the way. And I think that's really true. Now, I'm not an experienced writer or a historian or a psychologist or a philosopher or even an experienced speaker, but rather I'm the daughter of Henry Larsen, a man who was seldom home when we were growing up. I know Roald Amundsen only from what he wrote or from what was written about him. But I did gain some insights into how my father thought by working on his autobiography, and have come to recognize what must be inborn traits in these men of Norse heritage. In the left picture is Henry Larsen in his cabin on St Roch. It was taken about 1944 or 45. But today, if you look in his cabin, there's something missing on the forewall. On the right is a picture of Roald Amundsen that hung in where Larsen's uniform now hangs. And it also hung in his study after he retired. Both were modest men. They didn't enjoy public speaking. They had deep and faithful friendships. They were egalitarian, valued people for their efforts and knowledge. They were orderly and responsible. They were never boastful or laid blame on others. They were outstandingly patriotic. And they had everlasting passion for the lands of the Ice King, the Arctic. Hunford described Amundsen like an eagle in a cage that couldn't get out. And as in our family, we said of our father, Henry Larsen, he was like a caged lion. Two routes were known to exist. When following childhood aspirations, these men set out to traverse the Northwest Passage. Neither had been fully navigated. But why were they successful in guiding their ships through the Northwest Passage and safely overwintering in the Arctic for several years even, where so many had failed? They both had only old British Admiralty maps of earlier voyages. Even by Larson's time, there was still scant contact with the outside and very little chance of obtaining additional supplies. They used techniques used by mariners for centuries: a lead line, a compass where it worked, the sun or stars when the weather was clear, dead reckoning, and the slight swell beneath their feet indicating open water ahead. Larsen and Amundsen were both Norwegian, a country where individual skills and experience were more important than what class you belonged to, where using information gained from indigenous people and adopting some of their ways wasn't considered going native. Looking at the family origins of these two men shows that there are definitely some connections between them, and it also provides some insights into their attitude. Amundsen came from a family that at that time was very wealthy. Larsen from a very poor one. Amundsen's formal education, although his attention was seriously lacking, was many times greater than Henry Larsen's mere 6 years in a small island school. When Henry Larsen was born in 1899, Norway belonged to Sweden. His family lived on the small island of Herfel, a distal member of a chain of granitic Valar Islands in the Oslo Fjord, extending from Fredrikstad over to the Swedish border. Valar people had led a marginal existence, farming and fishing on poor soil from at least the Nordic Bronze Age. The longest remains of a Bronze Age grave lie on the hill behind the school that Henry attended. And there's a church built over 1,000 years ago sitting over the site of a pagan temple on the adjacent larger island of Sherkøy. The house where Henry was born was on a small peninsula of Herfel called Anholmen, or Duck Island. At the time, it was occupied by 11 people, including his mother, grandmother, and 2 uncles. Some of the inhabitants had come from Sweden to work at the herring processing shed, which once was on the property. 3 uncles are shown in this photo. To the left, his foster father, center and right, his uncles with whom he went to sea. They were brothers of his mother. Henry was orphaned to the care of his grandmother and one of the uncles. He was a well-loved little boy, but times were very difficult. At the age of 2 or 3, he was sent to farming relatives in Sweden. Norway was ceded to the King of Sweden after the Napoleonic Wars. It was impoverished by huge debts owed because of their former Danish-Norwegian union. Although Norway had a separate constitution, it was not truly independent. There were many threats of war and years of negotiations. Meanwhile, Norway's merchant fleet became one of the world's largest and an important factor in the Norwegian economy. Eventually, the Norwegian Parliament declared the dissolution of the Norwegian-Swedish Union in 1905. And there was really great rejoicing in Norway. This was also the time when Henry was to start school. So this little Norwegian boy had to be sent back to Herfel. There was yet another cause for great rejoicing. News of Roald Amundsen's successful transit of the Northwest Passage had reached Norway. Little Norway had triumphed over the great world power, England. It was great interest to the people of Herfel for one more reason. Amundsen's family was from the Valar Islands. Even at that young age, Henry Larsen decided, inspired by this heroic event, that he would go to the Arctic too. His favorite subject at school were history and geography. He read all the stories about polar regions that he could get his hands on. But already by that time, his hero Amundsen was preparing for a new voyage into the polar region. In the early 1800s, Roald Amundsen's grandfather, Ole, had settled on one of the worst pieces of farmland in Valar, on the island of Sherkøy. He had struggled to clear a very large debt. Fortunately, though, in 1821, through his wife's father, he inherited a very good property called Sandbrekka. Roald Amundsen's father, Jens, was born there as one of 4 sons of Ole's very large family. But how was it that the Amundsen family, from essentially a poor place in a poor country, became so very rich? The end of the Napoleonic Wars, the industrialization of mid-19th century, the spreading concept of free trade, and the Scandinavist political movement all provided an opportunity for hard-working, seafaring people who were willing to take risks. Many European powers were moving into the age of steam, giving the Norwegians an opportunity to buy their sailing ships. Ole and his sons managed to prosper as merchants, ship captains, and owners. Norwegian ship owners made fortunes carrying neutral tonnage during the Crimean War. Jens Amundsen transported goods and lumber to Britain and North America, and grain and Chinese coolies to Cuba. With 2 brothers and a brother-in-law, he operated up to 22 ships, speculated in lumber, fish, spices, salt, tea, coffee, and he also carried immigrants to North America. In 1884, they purchased joint properties in Borge, along the biggest river in Norway, the Glomma, just north of Fredrikstad. Here they could repair and eventually build ships. The slide there shows several maps of the river and the location of Tomta, the Amundsens family home. I always wondered how it was, because I had visited the area, and where was it that they actually built these ships, because I certainly couldn't see where there was a place for docking. But the map on the upper right side indicates where there was a landslide in 1925. And that map shows the docking area just below the house. And of course that would have been obliterated partially in the landslide that took place there. Here's a peek into the interior of Tomta, where Jens and his wife Gustava lived and where Roald Amundsen was born in 1872. This area in Borge and Herfel, where my father was born, are a scant 10 miles apart as the crow flies. But Gustava longed for city rather than rural life, and the family moved to Christiania, now Oslo, in 1881. Young Amundsen was a great reader. He devoured stories of polar exploration. Franklin's treks along the western shore, though, of the polar sea was what most intrigued him. And he also read of Nansen's crossing of Greenland, which enthralled him. Schoolwork didn't interest him, but he was determined to become an Arctic explorer and to navigate that fabled Northwest Passage. Father Jens was now working for the Norwegian Ministry of Trade and often traveled to London, but he died while traveling back to Norway when Roald was only 8 years old. Now, Roald's 3 older brothers had chosen careers at sea, but their mother was determined that Roald was going to go to university and study medicine. But his Arctic goal persisted, and his methodical approach to this soon became evident. Roald and several schoolmates trained in the mountains west of Christiania to become physically fit. When Gustava died in 1893, Roald was now 21, and he was free to go more or less his own way. From his extensive reading, Amundsen already realized that divided loyalties was a common failing with early polar voyages. Captains and expedition leaders gave conflicting orders and had conflicting ideas. So he decided to study for his master's ticket. His hard initiation was on a sealing ship in the Arctic. Then he put in his time for his mate's papers on one of his family ships, and he thought that was quite boring. In 1896, at 25, Amundsen sailed into the Antarctic as second mate on Adrian de Gerlach's ship, the Belgica. It was the first ship to overwinter in Antarctica and made the furthest voyage south to that date. The American Frederick Cook was doctor on that ship and had Arctic experience in Greenland with Perry. Amundsen learned much about survival techniques and also leadership on that trip. His Antarctic experience drew him to the attention of Nansen, who became his strong supporter and very great influence. Now Amundsen felt he was ready to tackle the Northwest Passage, which had defeated many expeditions over 4 centuries. The existence of a South Passage had been established by men like Franklin, Collinson, and John Rae. Another passage had been found through the Prince of Wales Strait, but neither of these passages had been completely traversed by ship. The well-connected Amundsen consulted with Arctic authorities such as Leopold McClintock, Alan Young, Sir Clement Markham, and Richard Collinson. For land travel, McClintock espoused using dogs. Markham, though, was rigidly opposed to dogs or skis and advocated only man-hauling. But Amundsen, in his typical way, judged for himself. Now McClintock advised Amundsen that the only navigable route was east of King William Island, using the island as a shield against the polar ice stream. At this point, though, I want to say something about that direction of the circulation of Arctic ice, because many of you may not be familiar with this. There are 2 main factors it depends on, other than wind direction. Although right now, with global warming, there seems to be some changes taking place. The Arctic ice circulation depends on 2 main components. One is the Beaufort Gyre, which is a pattern of ocean and clockwise ice circulation in the Beaufort Sea. The second factor is the transpolar drift stream from Russia. The transpolar drift pushes some of the ice from that Beaufort Gyre against Greenland and against the Canadian Arctic archipelago. This ice that's pushed here becomes very compressed and thick. This means that heavy ice pushes down the Bering coast, which is the graveyard of many ships. It pushes down the Prince of Wales Strait, and then there is the eastward push south of Victoria Island. There's push down McClintock Strait, and both the east and west sides of the Somerset Boothia Peninsula. Such an undertaking as Amundsen was planning would require financial backing. To get this backing, the expedition would need a scientific goal. Nansen's interest in expanding scientific knowledge of the Arctic influenced Amundsen's thinking about choosing an appropriate goal. In 1891, James Clark Ross had discovered the location of the magnetic North Pole. But was it fixed, or did it shift from one location to another? That was an ideal aim. In 1902, Amundsen had obtained his captain's ticket. He could now command a ship anywhere in the world. So now he studied magnetism in Hamburg under the foremost expert on terrestrial magnetism in the world. In 1900, using his inheritance, Amundsen had bought a small, sturdy, and inexpensive 70-foot Hardanger fishing sloop, the Yo, of 47 tons displacement with 2 tiny cabins and a 13-horsepower engine. His trial run was to Greenland, carrying out oceanographic research for Nansen. He was now 29. Following that, he carried out 2 years of meticulous planning. His expedition should be made of the smallest group possible, and all the men should be experienced in their fields. There were 7 men in all, and they're listed there next to the picture of Amundsen in his cabin. Amundsen's theory for success as a leader was that each man should be fully occupied and responsible for more than one task. They should know that their personal effort was important for the success of the expedition. No time should be wasted on useless assignments, and there would be a democratic relationship between members. Amundsen had often been bailed out of his debts by the family and by Nansen, and now again he had accumulated a considerable debt. And on June 16th, 1903, heavily loaded, they left Christiania during the night and in torrential rain to escape his creditors, and headed for the Northwest Passage. I think that perhaps there's another reason that they left in the night. I think that Amundsen did not want any fuss or celebration made until he had successfully completed his voyage. The other thing about leaving in the night reminds me of why my father always left in the night. You know, an inspector comes and checks that the ships aren't overloaded before they take off, or at least this is what happens in my dad's area, and I'm sure that it happened before. And so my dad used to have the inspector come in the afternoon or evening or whatever, and he would set off 10 or 11 o'clock at night and take the ship, St Roch, over to the fueling dock, and there he would fill all the barrels that had been, the fuel barrels that had been sitting on the deck. So that ship, his ship, always went into the Arctic overloaded. So I just think that Amundsen must have had some of the same thoughts. Amundsen picked up 20 sled dogs in Greenland and then followed Franklin's course, Beechey Island to Peel Sound to Franklin Strait and to Cape Felix. He followed McClintock's advice about taking the route east of King William Island. With the small ship, they were able to successfully maneuver through the shallow waters where earlier large ships had failed. Even so, around Matty Island, they were grounded several times and even prepared to abandon ship. Amundsen blamed himself, nobody else, for running aground, even though some of his crew were experienced seamen. And he vowed that they would always keep one man aloft and take constant soundings. Passing through what is now St Roch Basin, finally they reached the protected natural harbor on King William Island, close to the magnetic pole, which they named Yo Haven. 2 years were spent here, which afforded the opportunity for Amundsen to test his theories of survival. They carried out ethnographic studies on various groups of Inuit and their adaptation to their environment. They learned to drive a dog sled, even though theoretically they knew what to do, but they lacked practice before. They observed and tested their clothing, their food, feeding their dogs, and he gained everlasting respect for the capabilities of those Inuit people. 1804 was a very good ice year. Amundsen was tempted to continue westward, but there was his obligation to carry out the magnetic observations. Amundsen and Peter Ristvedt determined the location of the magnetic North Pole near but slightly north of Cape Adelaide, Regina, where it had been located by James Clark Ross. And Hansen and Ristvedt mapped the east part of Victoria Island. In 1905, the conditions had changed dramatically. They had to resume their voyage, groping their foggy, uncharted way through shallow and very rapidly eastward drifting ice. When they finally arrived at King Point, Yukon, they learned of Norway's independence, but it was there that they became frozen in. And when they arrived the next year in Nome, Alaska, Amundsen, they learned, was a famous man. He had expected to earn money from the newspaper for the first word about their success. He had earlier gone by dog sled to Nome, or to Eagle, Alaska it was. He'd gone, and to send a telegram to let the world know, but unfortunately his telegram had been intercepted and the news published. So it meant instead of being able to pay off his debts for the trip, for the money gained for this first news, now Amundsen had to give a series of lectures to gather funds. And lecturing was something he didn't enjoy, and as a matter of fact, neither did my father enjoy. So now back to little Henry Larsen. His path was somewhat different, but his persistence was the same. As a boy, he did chores for the neighbors and sailed pilots out to the ships. At 14, after 6 years of schooling, he went to sea with his two uncles on their sloop, the Anna. And if you look at the picture there, you will see that it's the same type of ship as Jo, carrying fish, lumber, and cobblestones to Sweden and Denmark. But at 15, he was really restless and set out into the world, and he signed onto a bark headed for the Americas. Other ships and countries followed: the Bowman, the Indian Girl, the General Gordon, in which he was shipwrecked off the coast of South Carolina, and his first steamer, the Vinstra, to South America, Africa, and the East Indies. By now he had served 4 years before the mast and was eligible to enter the Oslo Nautical School. Adolf Lindström, whose picture is on the wall there, had served as cook on the Fram and Jo, and he was teaching there while Larsen was at the nautical school, and Sverdrup visited. On graduating as a navigator in 1920, he qualified, like Amundsen, to take any ship anywhere in the world. In the meantime, though, in 1910, Amundsen had officially set out to reach the North Pole from the west using Nansen's Fram. But instead, he secretly headed south to Antarctica and successfully reached the South Pole in 1911. That was the year Scott's expedition ended in tragedy because of very poor planning. During those difficult economic times, and desperate to support himself after completing his military service, Larsen and a friend joined a ship of the Fred Olsen line as strikebreakers. Then, as fourth mate, he signed onto another Fred Olsen ship, the Theodore Roosevelt, which took him to Seattle and the Orient. In Seattle in 1922, he finally met his hero, Roald Amundsen. Amundsen was there arranging passage home to Norway for his pilot, Oscar Omdahl, aboard the Theodore Roosevelt. Amundsen had made an effort to drift eastward over the pole with his new ship, the Maud, but the effort had failed, and his ship was left drifting in the ice somewhere off Wrangel Island. Then he turned his sights to flying over the pole. Amundsen and his pilot, Oscar Omdahl, had carried out flight trials in Alaska in preparation for flying to Svalbard, but his plane, a Curtiss Oriole, was damaged beyond repair, and the idea had to be temporarily given up. Amundsen's creditors, seized the Maud, and sold it to the Hudson Bay Company, and they renamed it the Bay Maud. The captain of the Theodore Roosevelt, Captain Tomley, said of Roald Amundsen to Henry Larsen, "I've no use for these idlers, tourists, or people who throw away time and money going on expeditions that wander around among the ice of the polar regions." On that Norwegian ship there was no free ride, and Amundsen had to bunk with the crew and work as an oiler. Larsen, of course, as fourth mate, had a nice cabin, and he offered some storage space in his cabin to Amundsen, and their long discussions renewed his interest in the Arctic again. Obviously, Larsen paid little heed to Tomley's opinion. The following year, he read in the newspaper that a Danish trader, Christian Klingenberg, who had been going into the Western Arctic since 1905, was in Seattle buying a ship called the Maid of Orleans. Now, it was difficult to get away into the Arctic at that time, but Larsen saw his chance and resigned his post as now third mate and headed for Seattle. Klingenberg needed a navigator. Larsen made 2 voyages with Klingenberg in 1924-25 and in 1927. Just as Amundsen had learned from the Netzilik people around King William Island about key Arctic survival skills, Klingenberg's sons, his son-in-law Iki Bolt, and Fred Wolke were Larsen's mentors. At Herschel Island, Larsen learned that the RCMP was going to build a supply vessel to service the Arctic detachments, since they were really badly suffering from being dependent on civilian trading vessels. That ship was the St Roch. The commanding officer of the Western Arctic recognized Larsen was just the sort of man that they needed, and he encouraged him to apply for naturalization and admission to the RCMP, but he had to wait for 4 years before he could become naturalized. The St Roch was built at Burrard Dry Dock of North Vancouver in 1927-28. It was to serve as that supply ship and floating police detachment. Colin Archer, Norway's foremost builder of wooden-hulled ships, had designed the Fram for Nansen, and he'd also built Amundsens Maud based on a modification of the Fram. Thomas Halliday, who designed the St Roch, had earlier been hired by the Hudson Bay Company to refit Maud, and he copied Maud's lines and certain construction features. One of the important features was the rudder, which could be raised up on deck through a specially constructed rudder well, as you could see if you examine the St Roch. They all had rounded egg-shaped hulls. The ice couldn't grip that hull, and it also allowed them to rise up as the ice pressed against the sides. The disadvantage was that they would buck and heave like broncos at sea. The earliest photos of the St Roch also show some triangular protrusions beneath the rub rail. I think it's called the rub rail anyway. And they used to grip the hull in the ice like teeth combs or comb teeth, and also they would impede the speed forward through the ice. So one of the first things Larsen did was have them knocked off. Larsen had watched the ship under construction and saw lots of faults, but he still wasn't part of the crew, and he certainly couldn't offer an opinion in that position. He spent the next 16 years gradually working away on improvements until she became what the St Roch is today. There were several major problems, one being that from the tiny pilot house, one couldn't see over the bow. So the only navigator, which was my father, spent hours in the crow's nest. Like Amundsen, Larsen had a small crew, rarely more than 8. As members of the RCMP, they were organized and disciplined men with a fine sense of comradeship. Moreover, the St Roch had so many tasks there wasn't really much idle time. The experience of the St Roch crew was significantly different than that of the Yoas, though. The St Roch was staffed like any land detachment. Few men had previous maritime experience. Even on the 1940-42 Northwest Passage voyage, half the crew had never been on a boat before. That didn't bother my dad. He could train these men without established ideas about how shipboard things should be done. As a matter of fact, he said that if he had had a crew of sailors, that they would have mutinied. Like Amundsen, Larsen was not a hard taskmaster. One of the crew in an interview said that Larsen never gave orders, he just asked you to do things, and you did. His friend Joe Olson told me that even on his first trip in 1928, Larsen had asked the officer commanding of Herschel Island Detachment if he could proceed through the Northwest Passage, since conditions seemed to be favorable. And the answer? Unthinkable. Other years, when the ice conditions appeared favorable, he again asked. In 1936-37, when Sir James McBride, the then commissioner, toured the North, he asked, only to be reminded that they were RCMP officers and not explorers. I really found this kind of interesting because McBride was adventurous himself. In the early 30s, he flew several solo trips across Canada and was instrumental in the development of flight in Canada. The St. Roch's job was to exercise Canadian sovereignty over the North. That is, to actively exercise responsibility and stewardship, to administer, to monitor, and to react to threats of our lands. Policing, as we think of it, was the very least of their jobs. Instead, they carried out long patrols, determining the conditions of the Inuit population, assisting its inhabitants in the north, and a myriad of other things, like determining positions of navigation aids, determine the speed of water flow down the rivers, all sorts of things. As with Amundsen's crew, they dressed, traveled, and hunted like and with the Inuit. It wasn't until World War II that the Great Assignment, as it's called, was ordered. There's clear evidence that in 1940, the St. Roch was originally supposed to be part of a contingent to secure the cryolite mines of Greenland. Larsen intended to use the previously incompletely traversed route through Prince of Wales Strait. When they departed from Vancouver, June 21st, which was already late in the season, Canada and the United States were still wrangling over Greenland. The U.S. would not support any Canadian move into Greenland. The indecision dragged on. But ice and tides wait for no man. Besides, there were still lots of jobs to be done. 1940-42 were bad ice years. St. Roch wintered in 1940 at Walker Bay in Prince of Wales Strait. The ship was frozen in until late July that 41. The spring brought additional assignments. The ice didn't break up because the wind was in the wrong direction. If they were to get eastward, they had to go through Yoa's more southerly route. During the war, RCMP and some Hudson Bay posts in the eastern Arctic were closed. They couldn't be supplied. The Americans had more or less free rein over the eastern Arctic, and a Canadian presence was needed. St Roch, like Yoa, met perilous conditions east of King William Island, but in this case it was from heavy ice. Familiar with Amundsen's description of shallows, Larsen kept towards the Boothia shore. Even so, they were pushed into Paisley Bay, making their way out through Bellot Strait. They too prepared to abandon ship. This slide is of the crew on their arrival at Halifax. One, Frenchy Chartrand, I have just inserted into the photo. He died while they were overwintering in Paisley Bay. Then in 1944, the St Roch was called on to make the westward voyage. Larsen had his opportunity to set through the yet unconquered deep northerly route that had eluded him in 1940. But Larsen had to hustle up half the crew himself. This lower left picture shows 5 civilians that made up the crew. Cashin was just 16, and actually my dad had to get permission from his mother to take him along, and he was assigned as his guardian. This fact is often unmentioned in the telling of the St Roch story. They talk about going eastward and then westward to the Northwest Passage, not saying anything about the fact that it was a route that was previously incompletely traversed. And that's one that is important for commercial use today, or will be. Anyway, in all, Henry Larsen spent 25 years in the Arctic, overwintering during 11 of them. But there's a few more connections between Larsen and Amundsen that I'd like to tell you about. In 1926, Amundsen, along with Omdahl, Nobile, and others, they flew the airship Norge over the pole. It landed in Nome, near Teller, Alaska, was dismantled and taken home. Some places I've read that it crashed there, but I really haven't, I don't know definitely whether they landed or crashed. But there was still various materials lying around in 1928 when the St Roch stopped there during its first trip north. Many of the Eskimos had parkas made from the silk covering. Some was even aluminum coated. My dad said we all picked up some souvenirs. My father gave me the scraps of material he picked up, and they're now in the Vancouver Maritime Museum collection. Another connection. In 1936, the St Roch wintered at Cambridge Bay. Before the spring thaw, Larsen made a patrol to Yoa Haven area, and there he met Inuit who remembered Amundsen's crew. Amundsen's mod, now renamed the Bay Mod, had pitifully ended up deserted and rotting in Cambridge Bay. The Inuit valued the wood though, and they'd stripped most of the deck. The hull was a hazard to shipping, and oil tanks must have been left almost full. Every spring, bird feathers were covered with her leaking oil, and the waters through which the fish traveled up the river were contaminated. During that stay in 1936, the Hudson Bay officer asked Larsen if he would blow up the mod to release the oil once and for all. But before that, though, the St Roch needed a second crow's nest, and Larsen and one of the men built a good big square one from some of the mod's deck. The crow's nest that they built is now in the Maritime Museum in Halifax, I believe. And he wrote about that. What a shame that this lovely ship, built only in 1918, practically new, should have been allowed to end her life in that ignoble way. I had seen her in 1925 when Amundsen's crew brought her to Seattle after having drifted in the ice and spending a couple of winters frozen fast in the ice off the Siberian coast. Then the Norwegian government and the people had let her go to the Hudson Bay Company for just a few $1,000s to clear a bit of debt that Amundsen had incurred on his journey. The town of Cambridge Bay used to be on the other side of the bay until the 1950s. So I cut and pasted this picture together. No wonder the sad remains of the Maud are referred to as Amundsen's ghost. Of the Necheli Eskimos particularly, Amundsen said, "My sincerest wish is that civilization may never reach them." And I think what he meant by this was that their way of life was so in tune with what was required to live there and couldn't be improved on by people who considered themselves civilized, that he hoped that they were never influenced much by people from the outside. In 1949, when Henry Larsen was appointed officer commanding of RCMP G Division, which at that time included over half of Canada, he was determined to do all that he could to correct government shortcomings and mistaken policies regarding the Inuit that he knew to be in existence. His call for a royal commission into the plight of the people he knew so well and loved was ignored, and it brought him a lot of heartache. As I said at the outset, Amundsen and Larsen were great patriots. For Amundsen, it was Alt for Norge, vi elsker det landet. We love this land. For Larsen, I was filled with deep gratitude to my native country, Norway, which had given me ideals, dreams, and ambitions, and towards my adopted country, which had given me these many opportunities and honors. Henry Larsen didn't live to see his wish fulfilled, for St Roch to be placed under a shelter like Nansen and Amundsen's Fram, as an exhibit of Canadian tradition and pride. At a time when Arctic sovereignty is becoming more and more important, perhaps we should be providing more financial support for the preservation of the St Roch and other symbols of our great land. This is Doreen Larsen Riedel, and you're watching Sustainability Television.